guys. Good morning, good afternoon, good part of day. We are about to start the next event of large-scale Scrum community that originated in the United States, New York, and has gone viral and global. Today we have Markus Gaertner, the author of ATDD, Spec by Example, in the room, and he will be taking this away. Markus, thank you.
Thank you, G. So today I'm going to dive over why ATDD might be important in a multi-team environment. And I figured since the framing of the user group usually is around less, maybe let's start with less and have a brief look on that. So if you have multiple teams working on a single product and less favors their teams that are, so to speak, end-to-end responsible for the features they are developing. It might be that Team A is today in this sprint maybe working on a particular set of features, and Team B might be in the next sprint working on those features as well, or taking over from Team A, or so to speak. And well, problem arises then when Team A needs to sort of transfer some knowledge of what they've done towards Team B so that they can make consistent adaptations to whatever they make. And one way, obviously, to do it is TDD, ATDD, or specification by example. So that's why we're diving into that. So I sort of already answered the beginning question, so to speak. And let's dive deeper into that. If you take a look in less on the technical excellence, you see that we have specification by example on the topmost left. We also have acceptance testing on the right side, and both, so to speak, go hand in hand. And we're going to strive to gather both of that today. So let's try to define that. And I'm usually using the term specification by example, ATDD, behavior-driven development, or what have you, sort of in not in a way that I'm relying on that term or that term. I think they share similar benefits, and so let's have a look on that. So first of all, I got to know this cycle by a little bit Hendrickson back in 2009, I think it was. The phrases I learned by Elizabeth back in 2009, where she said, right, ATD really means discuss, develop, deliver. And then you continue in such a cycle, and we're going to dive deeper into all these three different clouds. The first thing is just discussing what's coming up in a workshop, so everyone has a clear understanding. Usually when you work in the Scrum setting, that might be your backlog refinement where that happens, or it might be a separate workshop where that happens. And we're going to dive deeper into that kind of specification workshop, is how Gaertner eventually turned out to call it. Then whenever you have a feature in your sprint and you work on that, then you discuss in a workshop examples by which you know whether or not they are done eventually. And while you're working on that particular feature, you try to use those examples to drive your development and have a better understanding of that you might be potentially done. In the end, when you deliver that, those automated examples that you discussed up front with maybe your customer sort of become part of your living documentation system, and by a press of a button, you know what the system currently does by just looking at the automated acceptance testing. So let's dive a bit deeper into each part of that. So discuss in a workshop. Well, maybe let me tell you a story from my previous employer. I came across Gaertner and Bridging the Communication Gap, I think in 2008, 2009-ish, around that. I read his book, and my previous work setting, I eventually was able to convince different people to have such a workshop. And we never automated the things in the end, but having a clear understanding of what we wanted to do already helped us to deliver what needed to be delivered. The setting was that we had a product development department and formed a system integration department that was in charge of making customizations for clients, for customers in the end. And there was, so to speak, the system integration department was a customer, an internal customer of the product development department. So at one point, a particular client needed some kind of feature, and we needed some product adaptations for that. And in order to, there had been some past experiences where whatever the product development was working on sort of wasn't quite that thing that we needed. We had maybe extended efforts in the system integration departments of what the product development delivered to us in order to get it really usable for the clients, for the customers, and stuff like that. And we sort of thought, okay, let's give this a shot. We sort of got representatives. We got the product manager from the product together with the product developers. It was a quite large product, and we had sort of representatives from different components in that product, and also 2 or 3 representatives from the system integration department. I sort of facilitated that, and we were at the end of a 2-hour setting able to get together 3 to 4 examples, if I recall correctly. And those examples then had a clear understanding of what the system integration department needed, and the product development sort of agreed to, okay, this sounds reasonable and we don't have too much effort going into that. About 3 months later, we got that delivery and it worked just fine. We never revisited, so to speak, the examples. So just having a specification workshop is what I learned there. Might be reasonable as well to maybe start with that, because that's usually the easiest part of all of that. So if you continue to go forward, what makes a specification workshop work, so to speak? So sooner or later, if you dive into the literature, you find the original blog entry from George Dinwiddie, who said, well, you basically need at least 3 amigos. You need someone from the business side, that's depicted here as the business analyst. That's where we had, for example, the product manager of the product in my previous company, sort of represented that part. We have the product developers, that's the second amigo that we need. And sort of between those two, you can have a look at that as the business side is sort of able to describe the problem domain. The development side is able to sort of describe the solution domain. And it might be that they talk past each other. And it would be helpful to have someone that's able to digest from both sides in example form, for example, what they meant, and maybe reflect back that they sort of talk past each other and don't have a common understanding of what's happening there. So you need to have at least 3 different amigos. In my previous employer, we did this in a sort of workshop setting with more than 3 people in there, but we sort of made sure that we had all those 3 different hats in there as well. We're going to share the slides later on. You can have a look at the original article here from George Dinwiddie as well. I linked that. A bit later, something I came across from the behavior-driven development community was called example mapping, which is quite interesting approach. I initially learned that by attending a conference session. I think it was Medwin, if I recall correctly. The idea here is that basically for each feature, each story you want to develop, there are maybe 1, maybe 3 different business rules that needs to be fulfilled. And he made the claim that business rules and examples are usually two different things. In order to help understand what the business thinking behind that is, maybe you need one example, maybe you need five. And they sort of turned this upside down together with the Three Amigos concept and said, I like that story a lot. After their daily meeting, there's a group of three people coming together in a Three Amigos setting. They take 20 minutes of time, go into the backlog, pick out one story from the backlog that hasn't been brought to the state where the team says we can work on that. Then the three amigos work for 20 minutes on that to identify business rules, find examples. Maybe there are business rules where you don't need an example because it's so obvious, for example, and they might come across different questions and sort of put that in a grid, I would say, using color coding. Then they pack all the things together and put it back into the backlog, and the product owner maybe goes over the course of the day and tries to figure out answers for all the questions that they identified after the daily meeting. And the next day, a different group might be there together. I never, I wasn't able to work with a group to establish that kind of sort of ongoing day-to-day product backlog refinement, but I found that idea pretty clever because in the end, you already have those examples that exemplify your business rules. And if you're used to that, you can even automate that in the end. Okay, link to the original article is also up there. I'm a bit concerned because the BDD community has had some kind of shape up in the last year or so. I hope that link still works. If we continue, here's an example I picked from my book. So how do these examples look like in the end? This is a real world example to the states that that's actually something we found on an airport website. So this is a calculator for travelers who want to go from an airport and maybe leave their car there and want to make sure that whenever they come back from their vacations, they still have enough money in the pocket to get back their car, right? And that particular airport had 5 different parking lots. It's short-term parking where you just collect someone that's arriving at the airport, longer-term garage or surface parking if you want to have your car exposed to the weather conditions. There's also an economy parking lot, and there's also a valet parking. And you have different rules for that thing. And we sort of picked the rules from that website, from that airport. I think it might be a bit outdated, but I'm not sure. I didn't cross-check whether or not the ticket fines still apply today or whether they changed. So if you want to pick now, for example, the short-term parking rules, that's what I picked in the next slide on the examples going forward. You could say, all right, you can read what's in here, but what does for each additional half hour mean? And you have a 24-hour daily maximum. Does that mean for the second day, for example, someone stays longer, what happens on the second day? Is it when you park for 24 hours and half an hour additionally, do you get charged $26 or not? That's the thing that you would discuss, for example, in a specification workshop. And the result of that might look something like this. So you have 30 minutes costs $2, 1 hour still $2. With 3 hours and 30 minutes, you go up to $7. And basically, this kind of table you see in the lower left here would be something that you would identify in a specification workshop and take those examples when you go into your sprint, go into your iteration and try to work on that. And you're sort of on the bridge here towards the develop thing. I you can see here already, I used a behavior-driven development framework for that. If you represent those examples then in a test automation framework that's able to use that kind of natural language, and you don't need to sort of translate that into some more technical terms and to have a translation there between what you discuss in the workshop and what you work on in the iteration and stuff like that. If you have nearly word for word what you discussed in the workshop, in your examples, when you automate them, that has a reflective thing that whoever the business stakeholder was that you came up with the examples, he can see, all right, that's what we discussed. All right, the system is doing that. And in the end, it doesn't matter whether or not you automate on the GUI or just automate the business rules behind that. And there are tools that allow that kind of, I don't recall the English word for word, the literal automation approach here, and help you navigate that. The family of BDD tools out there is obviously able to do that, and other tools that would be in my toolbox would be to have a look at fitness. I worked in my previous employer quite heavily with fitness because we sort of introduced that there. And the robot framework is another test automation framework that's able to literally automate all those things. But I also see that you can do that in a unit test approach whenever whoever needs to read that is comfortable reading maybe some more code-like examples in that. So if you go further into developing concurrence, I recall a workshop I gave a couple of years back where had about a day to go over, discuss, develop, deliver with workshop participants. And we worked on specification workshops in the morning. I recall that the product owner went into their product backlog, their real product backlog, in order to have a specification workshop right there in the training setting that I ended up with. And in the afternoon, I challenged the group. So they split into different groups. Each of them tried a different tool, a different approach to automating these examples we came up with from their real product backlog entry. And I recall one group was able not only to try out one particular test automation tool, but they already implemented that story. It's the only time I've seen that during a training setting, one group was able to do that. I still think they were pretty advanced. They had the right size of the product backlog entry that we picked, so that they were able to, in the end, not only automate the acceptance test for that, but also implement the feature in roughly a day. I'm still impressed years later. I already talked about tools worthwhile to investigating, but I don't want to dive into too much of a tool focus here. One thing I picked from the Summon Coaching website is called double loop TDD. So what we try to achieve here is, so one way would be to go and the developers write unit tests, implement the feature, while the testers work on automating the acceptance test, maybe with some support from someone more of a developer focus. That's sort of what most teams try to do. A bit more clever would be to use the test-driven development cycle of red, green, refactor, and so on, and add another loop outside of that. So we write a failing acceptance test. So we take one of the examples that we have in our story that we want to implement. Then we write a failing unit test for the functionality that's first of all needed in order to make the acceptance test in the end pass. We make that tiny test to pass, we refactor, then go to the next test. At some point, that particular component we're working on is good enough for now. Then we build on another component, develop all those in TDD, and in the end, we have maybe the 5 components that we need plugged together, so that our acceptance test for that first example passes. Then we go back, automate the next example, and build just enough in order to make that pass. It's sort of the cycle of TDD extended towards ATDD. And my previous employer, so they were working in the mobile phone business world. And I recall we had a bug from a customer, a mobile phone provider, where something wasn't right. And I recall that I took a look into that bug. It was assigned, it was a more traditional environment, I need to say. It was assigned to a programmer counterpart of mine, and me as a tester, I also took that. We had already some examples, and after maybe 15 minutes or so, I had a reproducing test for that failure condition. And I figured, all right, what do I do now? Do I wait until the developer is also finished, or do I go over to him and check with him in order to see is he struggling somewhere and so on? I ended up with a letter, and in the end, I recall that I checked in at my tester machine the correction for that bug because he wasn't able to reproduce it in his development environment and didn't have a reproducing test. So in the end, I eventually, with him together, paired together in order to fix that bug. That was quite amazing, and I realized that whatever we built up to that point was capable of giving us testers a different stance towards working with programmers and enabling collaboration there in just a single team. And I think it gets better if you think about having several teams working on different feature sets and having to transfer knowledge of a particular feature domain to another team, where you can just hand them over your automatic acceptance test. Probably they're checked in to your version control system, so they just check them out, run them, and whenever one of those tests fails, they know they probably broke something that the other team built before them, right? Does that make sense? Looks like it. There's one more on the develop side. So one thing I realized at my previous employer, maybe I should talk a bit about the backstory. How are we doing on time? Not sure whether
I think we didn't find Marcus. We probably, we'll take another 10 minutes if you want, then open up for Q&A. It's up to you.
Yeah, let's see. So a bit of a background from my previous employer. So I mentioned that we had a product development department and a system integration department. We didn't start with that. So we were building a billing solution for mobile phone providers. And the first customer we had was a mobile phone provider in Ukraine. They had like 12 million subscribers already. And whenever we wanted to install our system there, they eventually needed to transfer all their prepaid and all their postpaid accounts and subscribers to our platform as well. And so in the first year, we started with trying to migrate the postpaid subscribers to our platform. They had a legacy system that was quite unusual for them. They couldn't work in that anymore. That's why they bought our solution, where was sort of the first platform where you could have prepaid and postpaid subscribers worked on in the same system. And in the first year, we tried to migrate the first 1.5 million postpaid subscribers to our platform. So we needed to configure their different tariff groups and what they had into our system, and then slowly in production get all those 1.5 million over whenever tariff was dealt with correctly. And the company realized at a certain point that they were trying to build a product, but the first customer they had, the first mobile phone provider, triggered so much development effort that the whole product group was working just for that one customer. And they were planning to go to more customers afterwards. And they knew if we keep that setting that we have in this place, might not be a good idea to have all the product people working all the time for just one client, for one customer. So they figured we maybe need to restructure our organization, and that's when they installed the system integration department. I had been working with the testing department as a tester before, and I was asked whether I would be confident to maybe lead a test group in the new system integration department. And I said, yes, maybe, okay, yeah, let's try this. And only later I found out we have a big problem, because our test suite consisted of shell scripts that whenever you ran them took maybe 18 hours to complete, and then you weren't quite certain whether or not a shipment could go to the customer for user acceptance tests or whatever was in their process. And we did that. We maintained those shell scripts with 10 to 12 people up to that point. And the idea was of the system integration department that we should do basically the same work, but with just 4 or 5 people. So I knew we're probably going overwhelmed if we don't do anything different. And so I dove into literature concerning our perception of what the problem might be. Like we had a design problem in our test automation code and stuff like that. And eventually I came across agile software development books. And I think, so we finished the post-paid subscribers. And the next year, the 10 million or so prepaid subscribers should also be transferred. They had set this up in a more classical product development cycle. So there was an analyzation phase first, and we sort of fell into that gap between concluding the post-paid subscribers and the analyzation phase before getting real with the prepaid subscribers. And I asked my boss whether or not we could do something like that and reinvent, so to speak, our shell script approach. I got a go from my boss, and we invested 6 weeks before we sort of invited other testers from the department and so on, asked them to have a look, and said, we invested 6 weeks now. How does this look? Shall we continue or shouldn't we continue? And they said, this is good, continue. And after 18 weeks, we had transitioned everything that was in shell scripts developed over the course of the year towards our new approach that we had. And the point where I noticed this was successful was when we had actually people from the clients at our office who wanted to see how we're working and whether or not there are different approaches that might be worthwhile for them. Then I had a 2-hour time block or something like that for showing them how we're dealing with tests. And the different stakeholders from the client sat there and they asked me, can we buy this test solution? I didn't know about the business side there, but I said, happy to get this out. Not sure whether or not that eventually happened. I don't think so. But having the confidence from a client where he said, okay, we can read this, we can maybe make use of that on our own. We don't have a better approach to making sure that we develop the right tariffs there in your product, was reassuring that we did something right. When it comes to maintainability, the problem is you can end up with shooting yourself in the foot, so to speak. I recall that I ended up with thinking about what we built there with what I've shown here. So we had our application under test on the bottom, and we sort of coded examples in fitness. Fitness uses a wiki approach, which means you can run a wiki and then you have different sites there where you note down the examples that you want to have. Like if it's the 20th of the month and you haven't recharged, then your subscription should be foreseen to be blocked from the first of the next month and stuff like that we had in there. Maybe before we go to the next part, I'm going to take the raised hand. But let me first of all go through this here. So what we did there was we used as a test framework fitness, and fitness has a way of reading those different wiki sites and then looking for code that it's trying to trigger in order to maybe connect through to the application under test. We considered that. We weren't sure about whether or not we want to have fitness in the long run. And fitness and other approaches there work in the way that you have some kind of glue code layer that the framework expects to have. And beyond that, we try to create different components that work together. And in the end, before going to the application under test, you have libraries and drivers, something like Selenium comes into mind there when you're dealing with a web front end, for example, for your application. We were mostly concerned with working on API levels, and were able to trigger different stuff on the Java side. They also had a C++ component where you could write something into a queue and trigger them by that way, something like that. Those were all things that went through the different libraries and drivers. What we ended up doing was even writing unit tests for that support code. Our look today on that is all the support code that we wrote was basically sort of a waste, because those should be features of the application that we were testing. And but I wasn't able to convince the product development and the product manager to maybe have a more easy to integrate interface there for the different things. So that's why we needed to keep those components, and that's why we also ended up writing unit tests for that, because we sort of relied on that. And we knew that there were things we needed for the first provider in Ukraine, but there were also different providers coming. So we extracted a commonly used component from that, and all the different customer integrations then build up onto that. So I can see two raised hands before I go further. I'm not sure whether or not I pronounce the name
There is no
correctly.
particular order. I'm sure folks will forgive you if you mess it up a little. So pick one and then go to another one.
I think Mehboob was first.
Okay. Mahmoud, it's your time. Please ask.
Hi, my name is Chetan, and thank you so much for a good presentation. I just wanted to know, like, ATD is used only for the acceptance test criteria, or it can be even used in regular user stories, like as a user, I want this and so on. The reason I ask is that even the regular user stories, when we read, it is been written with the same format of ATDD. So is it okay to use the ATDD format, like when and how and so on, like in all the user stories, or it is related to one specific thing only?
Let me go back to this here. So usually what you have in the story description using maybe the connector format, as a user, I want so that usually you have a broad overview of what might be business rules behind that. And I like the approach of the example mapping here. For each of the business rules, they might be more complicated or not. If they are more complicated, it would be worthwhile to have maybe some exemplifying examples behind that. And what's the examples I work on are usually come from these exemplifying examples for different business rules here. When you compare that to unit tests, I heard the phrase, I think it was from J.B. Rainsberg, who said that we should stop calling it unit tests. It should be micro-level tests. The acceptance tests you work on in an ATDD setting are more macro-level. That gives you the benefit of knowing whether or not a feature might be ready or not. But it's not that much into closer technical details than micro-level unit tests might be. Not sure whether that makes sense.
Or I can rephrase the question little bit, like this ATDD can be used in which different components of lean and agile methodology? Can you give just on a high level the examples like ATD can be used in scenario 1, scenario 2, or scenario 3?
Well, I picked a Scrum example here where maybe a story in the product backlog, and then you identify as part of your product backlog refinement activities some kind of examples, and then when you are in the sprint working on it, you sort of automate that. In my previous employer, we used it in a more traditional setting where we didn't have sprints at all, but tried to identify what they had use cases. And for each of the business use cases, for example, we identified different things, different examples we wanted to automate, and we even put on more traditional test thinking there, having more traditional test identification methods thrown at that, like equivalency class buildings and stuff like that. So I still think it was ATDD that we used there, though we weren't. The problem came more from the side that we were not that much upfront involved whenever someone was talking about business rules, for example. It was usually the business analyst throw over a document towards my development counterpart, who then did some architecture and design in a different document. And from that architecture and design and the more traditional rule book, so to speak, business rule book, we derived examples that we wanted to automate. The benefit in an agile setting is usually that testers are involved more upfront than after the fact, where something might have gone wrong.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the question. There was another hand raised, Markus. Do you remember who it was?
I don't recall, but I taking the hand down as maybe it was a similar question, or
Perhaps.
we revisit it back after I'm through all of it.
Yep, thank you.
Hope that works. All right. So when it comes to deliver for acceptance, one way to think about that is you deliver that to maybe your product owner in a one-team Scrum setting. Usually in a multi-team Scrum setting, it's harder if you have 5 teams that are then showing their acceptance tests to the product owner, that might be overwhelming for them. That's why usually the setting in a less setting for the product owner comes a bit different, and you go directly in touch with customers in the end. So the examples that you talked about in product backlog refinement or specification workshops, I then use to show the solution, even maybe in the sprint, towards your customers, and have a better knowledge about whether or not you build the right thing, right? In the long run, that should become, so to speak, your living documentation system is the phrase that Wojtko there used in bridging the communication gap and specification by example. I like this graphic I took from the last website. You have examples that elaborate requirements, and when you automate those, and then examples become tests, and those tests then verify those requirements, and in the long run, with more examples that have been automated and have become part of your regular acceptance test suite, so to speak, you figure out that you have a living documentation system that you can revisit. How's this working here and stuff like that. I like fitness there a lot because in fitness, in the wiki interface, you could search for things, and we also put some basic lifecycle things, for example, and an overview from different documents into the wiki directly. So we had everything in one web space where you could not only see what the current system should be doing, but you could also read along a bit how the customer thought about that and stuff like that. So it was a real documentation system. I sometimes finding those information back in a text file or so a bit more bothersome, to be honest, but that can work as well if you're familiar enough with command line and so on. We're sort of on one point we sort of strived is how would you start? Maybe you have a setting with 5 different teams, you have a product, but didn't automate your acceptances up until this now. I think what works, I had a client a couple of years back, they had 10 teams working on, they were considering that as 3 products. I'm still not sure whether that should be 1 product or not, but so they had 10 teams, and for a 3 sprint cycle, one of the teams sort of went out of working on the product backlog and worked on improving different libraries, bringing new technologies up to date and stuff like that. And then they had some sort of handover to the next team after 3 sprints when the new team rotated in there. And I worked with 2 or 3 different teams there, going first steps with automating some of their acceptance criteria, so to speak, while they were not in the other 9 team sprint cycle, working on improvements, process improvements, and so on. And the idea was to maybe extend from that. So we built the first prototype there, and I would recommend, with getting started with that, having a sort of team that does the initial approach, finds out what tools work for them, and then see what the whole group can maybe take as a benefit from that. I'm not sure. I would like to prefer actually go through the remaining 3 slides and then take questions, because I know there's not much coming. I have a recap here as well. So discuss, develop, deliver, and continue from there on is, so to speak, the cycle that we go through multiple times to recap that. And I have a slide here with some literature that might be worthwhile to check out. I also already pointed to bridging the communication gap and specification by example as a shameless plug. Also put ATDD by example in the smallest thing here. And for the discussion part, I liked the first 2 BDD books, Discovery and Formulation, a lot, because you work through an example there with a team and get the underlying principles explained. And while working on automating tests and so on, I found the XINET test patterns and growing object-oriented software guided by tests totally worthwhile to read or have on your book, on your shelf or on your desk even, while you work on that, in order to make sure to not shoot yourself in the foot. And the last thing is how to maybe reach out to me, because I give lifetime support for everything that I do. So feel free to reach out to me whenever you have additional questions. But let's maybe dive into the questions that folks might have here. I think we have 10 minutes left or so.
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much, Marcus. That was a great talk. I see there was one more question from.
And I think there was one more question in the chat as well. It's the
It is the
same.
same person, yeah.
Same person.
I'm the same.
Awesome.
Yeah, if someone else is not going to pitch in, I just wanted to ask one question only. It is a 2-part question. First question is like, is that ATDD and the behavior-driven development, BDD, and sometimes they call like jerkin syntax, are all the one and the same thing, and or they are the different thing as such? That is my first part of the question. If you want to answer in a short way, that will be great. Then
Yeah,
I can ask you part B of my question.
the trouble is there's no short answer to that. So if you go back to the initial definition that Dan North gave, I think it was an article he published on Sticky Minds. He described BDD in a way that it incorporates specification workshop, ATDD, but also TDD. That's where things like aspect, for example, come in, where you work on a more micro level unit test setting, but also having the whole story you're working on in mind. But he also incorporates there things from the domain-driven design community, like getting to a ubiquitous language that's shared among the team, I don't recall all the other facets that are. So BDD initially was considered to be more than just ATDD. Today, though, so over time, what sticks mostly is that people think about the tools and how you represent things with that given when then syntax there. But BDD is more than that, would be my sort of complicated answer.
Okay, thank you. And one last question only. Like I have seen like in our company also people are used to creating the user story features or even epics in Microsoft tools like Microsoft Word as well as this Excel. So to run the jerking syntax like we have like feature, scenario, when and then. So do we require any specific tool to execute it effectively like Cucumber, or even if they have written in a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet, that is also fine for us.
It's pretty tool dependent. So fitness itself is built on the framework for integrated tests or FIT. The idea behind FIT was to read in an Excel sheet and use that tabular structure in there in order to do things, call code and stuff like that. So they basically built a tool that was able to be fed with Excel sheets, and the business analyst could then work on the Excel sheets and work on that. I've seen that at one client where I'm not sure what the English term there is. They were working in a medical setting on working on mammography, so breast cancer detection, and there was a whole process behind that. And so the testers there were more educated nurses or someone that really knew the business there well, and they were not that quite capable to also have the programming skills needed, for example. There are different tools. I don't recall the one. I think it was JBehave, if I recall correctly. JBehave initially also had the capability to read in open office documents, and not sure whether it was documents or spreadsheets at that point. But eventually those tools started there. And I think it's easy for a programmer to maybe write something like, let me import that text file and then work on that. Usually most tools the plain Cucumber and the JVM adaptations of that, I've worked in most of them, work on text files. And so you just need a text editor to do that. It's sometimes also working for business people. And it's quite tool dependent on where you are. So the idea behind fitness was to get rid of the Excel spreadsheets and maybe have a wiki interface where people could then not write spreadsheets, but in wiki syntax things. And depending on the tool, there are different approaches to that. But
Okay, thank you so much for your time. Yeah, thank you so much for your time. Yeah, I don't
always
have any.
recommend when you do when you try to evaluate which tool do you want to use, keep in mind who's going to work with the examples, who's going to need to read it, who's going to work with the automation, and also work with the formulation of the examples. And all of those folks should be comfortable with whatever you pick in the end. That's usually one recommendation I give when you try to evaluate what you want to use.
Okay, thank you again. Sorry, I asked 3-4 questions as there were no further questions. So thank you for giving me a chance to ask my question. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Hey, folks, anyone else wants to chime in and ask or anything? Markus is done with his main part. Anyone who is in software engineering business today, hands-on? Maybe yes, maybe no. Okay, well, we are coming up on the hour, so let's see. I'll go. Let's see, someone's in the chat. Okay, there's nothing in the chat. So we're gonna probably wrap this up. Marcus, you will kindly make the deck available, although
Yes.
lots of your good stuff is also available online, so people can get it from there. But we will have your deck eventually with the recording shared with those that would like to replay or people that missed this discussion. So
Will do.
did you want to have any do you want to make any wrapping statements, Marcus? Anything that's coming up on your end that you would like to let people know about? A workshop or a course or anything like that?
No, not really. I think with the things I put on here, you're probably best informed.
Sounds good. Well, if something does come to mind, please let me know and I'll include it in the distribution. Should be going out over the weekend.
Awesome.
So I want to personally thank you for coming out and doing this. I know for you it's probably getting late there, and I'm sure you got better things to do on Friday night than staring at a machine. So I want to
Well, it's
thank.
still 7 p.m.
I'm sorry.
It's still 7 p.m. It's okay.
Well, it's getting close to the beer time, so we don't want to interfere with the beer.
Yeah, that's for sure. Thank you, Gene.
Well, thank you very much for coming out. I appreciate it and glad seeing you again. I'm glad. Thank you everyone for joining, and we'll cut you loose so you can carry on with your daily routine on Friday, whatever is left of it. Okay? All the best.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.